Aussie Gamers Express presents.
Hello Aussie Gamers and welcome to the first episode of RoyBoy's Retro Rewind for 2017 and the third episode in the video series. This episode will explore driving games that have been released from the mid-1970s through to the present day, looking at some of the popular game titles that have been played and enjoyed by many. But before we get stuck into it, let's hear those famous words in motorsport.
Gentlemen, start your engines!
The late 19th and early 20th century saw the early years of the development of the motor car, and since its inception, man has been forever pushing the boundaries and limits of both himself and machine in the pursuit of speed and glory. Over time, only a few have managed to tame these beasts of metal, and many of us have only got as close as the grandstand trackside to get a glimpse of these speed machines and the drivers who control them. It is no surprise then that in the humble beginnings of video games in the mid-1970s, developers and game publishers were keen to develop and release video games in an attempt to recreate the thrill of driving race cars. Driving games and racing games are a gaming genre that has lasted from the early days of video games until the present day, and I'm sure will always be present as long as video games are released. Over the course of the past 40 years, there have been hundreds of driving games released, some serious, some fun, a few that are weird and wacky, as well as sick and twisted. And in this present day of gaming, driving games are moving closer and closer to providing as real as an experience you can get gaming without actually sitting in a real car. One of the first driving games ever released was from Japanese game developer Teato, titled Speed Race. It first appeared in arcades in 1973 and allowed players to steer a car on a simple road to avoid colliding with other cars. It was followed by Atari's Grand Track 10 in 1974, which was another arcade game that saw players race against the clock to accumulate as many points as possible by steering a small car around a track. Obstacles such as oil slicks and pylons would appear randomly in an attempt to hinder control of the car. The controls of the game were a steering wheel, 4-position gear shifter, as well as accelerator and brake foot pedals. Whilst very basic in its form, it would form a stable backbone for other driving games that would be released during the late 70s and early 80s. Another early title released in 1976 was another Teato creation, Crashing Race. The object of the game was, as the title suggests, and that was to crash into as many AI-controlled cars as possible in order to score the most points. That same year, Sega released Road Race, which introduced 3-dimensional graphics, displaying a constantly changing scrolling road with players controlling a race car in order to keep it on track. Another similar driving racing game to do this involved motorbikes and was titled Motocross. The game was based upon motocross competition and was also re-released under the name Man-TT, and to tie in with the popular TV show Happy Days, another version called The Fonz was also available. All three games were exactly the same and introduced feedback controls to a set of handlebars that were used as controllers, causing them to vibrate when the bike collided with another vehicle. Atari returned to the racing game scene in October of 1976 and attempted to introduce one of the first-person view driving games with Night Driver. The game displayed a series of posts by the edge of the road, and the object of the game was to keep the car from crashing into these. Most driving games from this time period were all fairly similar in style and gameplay and were mainly found on arcade machines. However, with the introduction of home consoles such as the Atari 2600 and PCs such as the Commodore 64, the 1980s saw a shift from video games being played in arcades to now becoming available in the home. Most of the early driving games previously released to date were renamed and retweaked and re-released on these new systems that were becoming available. Speed Racer comes to mind, which was very similar and almost identical to Le Mans 24 Hour that was released on the Commodore 64. As the 80s progressed, new driving games were in development, and three iconic games of this era include Turbo, Pole Position, and Pit Stop 2. Turbo required players to navigate a road race through different urban and rural locations, through differing weather conditions and changing times of day. In order to proceed, the player must pass and stay ahead of at least 30 competing cars before the time expires, with the AI opponents driving predictably while others would swerve across the road suddenly. Pole Position was one of the most popular coin arcade games of 1983, and it was also released in two configurations, a standard upright cabinet and also a cockpit cabinet in which players could sit in a mock race car. Both versions featured a steering wheel and a gear shifter for low and high gears, but the environmental cockpit cabinet featured both an accelerator and a brake pedal, while the standard upright one only featured the accelerator. It was one of the most successful racing games of the classic era, spawning ports, sequels, and a Saturday morning cartoon, although the cartoon had very little in common with the game. The game established the conventions of the racing game genre, and its success inspired numerous imitators. The player had to complete a time trial lap within a certain amount of time to qualify for an F1 race at the Fuji racetrack. After qualifying, if successful, the player would then race against 7 other AI-controlled cars in a championship race. Pole Position was the first racing video game to feature a track based on a real racing circuit, and it was also the first game to feature a qualifying lap. Pit Stop 2 allowed players to not only race around the track, but required them to keep an eye on their tyres and fuel gauge as well. It gave the option for players to pull in for a pit stop and control the pit crew to change tyres and refuel the car. 6 international racetracks were available, and some of these included Brands Hatch, Hockenheim and Watkins Glen. Players also had the choice of either racing 3, 6 or 9 laps, and could choose from any one of 3 difficulty levels. As the 1980s rolled on, the introduction of the Nintendo Entertainment System and Sega Mega Drive to the games market allowed for newer and cooler games, and driving games were no exception. Many new ideas and concepts were beginning to fill the starting grid, as some serious attempts were beginning to be made to bring the top tier of motorsports to gamers. This would lead the genre of driving games to increase in popularity, and as such developers each began to put their own spin on it, which seemed to lead to an insurgence of motorcycle racing games as well as driving games in the late 80s and early 90s. One particularly successful example of this was Sega's Hang On. It was originally released on the Mega Drive, but there was also an arcade version of the game as well, which involved a near full-size motorcycle as the controller, in which players could sit on and control by leaning, revving the throttle and using brake levers. As well as its impressive frame rate and controller vibration feedback, the game was praised for the sophistication of its computer-controlled opponents. Sega would unleash another classic driving game with Outrun, a Ferrari driving game which perhaps had the most impressive graphics of its day, and uniquely branching circuits offered players a degree of choice in how they would drive the car and what route they would take. Players could even change the radio station on the car's stereo to hear different background music as they raced through each course, avoiding traffic and attempting to record the fastest time possible. The iconic tunes of Outrun have been recently released and made available on Spotify for those of you out there who wish to take a trip down memory lane. Ayrton Senna's Super Monaco GP2 was an arcade-style Formula 1 racing game that was released in 1992. Along with boasting the most realistic physics of its time, it was one of the best received console driving games at the time of release, and was endorsed by the then F1 Formula 1 world champion, the late F1 legend Ayrton Senna. The game's development was also assisted by Senna, who supplies his own advice about the tracks featured in the game. The 1990s saw driving games begin to move away from sprites and towards polygon-based 3D graphics. Technology was moving on, both in hardware and software, and driving games strapped themselves in and enjoyed the ride. In the arcades, one of my all-time favourite driving games was released in 1994, Daytona, USA.
Gentlemen, start your engines.
Based on the NASCAR stock car racing in the USA and featured the oval track of the title Daytona Speedway. The iconic music and engine sounds are one will never forget, and it is no surprise it is one of the highest grossing arcade games of all times. Sega also released Virtual Racing, a game accredited with popularising 3D graphics and creating the familiar camera change system that almost every driving game that followed would employ, allowing gamers to choose whether to play in the first or third person views. Namco created its own rival called Ridge Racer, and the pace with which graphics were improving seemed to hit the accelerator. Originally released in arcades and then on both the Sega Saturn and the Sony PlayStation, Ridge Racer offered players a range of play modes, circuits and cars in which to enjoy. Another arcade favourite from the 1990s was Sega Rally, which introduced gamers to the challenges of rally driving. This was achieved through the game's ability to drive on different surfaces, including asphalt, gravel and mud, with each surface having differing friction properties. This was the first driving game to achieve this, and as such, Sega Rally is considered to be a milestone in the evolution of the driving game genre. The 1990s, however, wasn't all serious, and slowly by the end of the decade, game developers and publishers were beginning to look outside the normal rules of driving gameplay and begin to add their own element of fun. One such example of this was Sega's Crazy Taxi. The arcade-style racer was one of the first open-world sandbox games that allowed players the chance to drive wherever they chose within the game world. The main objective of the game was to pick up passengers and deliver them to their chosen destination against an increasingly challenging clock in order to collect fares. Another more sadistic and controversial game in the driving genre was released in the late 90s called Carmageddon. It was a driving game like no other. There were multiple ways to win races, and players were praised for running over pedestrians and cows, and if all were eliminated from the map, the race was won. The other main way to win races was by destroying every other car on the track, as well as the more conventional method of actually completing a certain number of laps and being first to the checkered flag. From the late 90s through to today, the driving game genre has gone from a game of firsts to a generation of sequels and game series, each installment adding and improving on its previous title, sometimes to success and others to criticism. There are now numerous driving game series available, and some of the most notable ones include Burnout, Grid, Need for Speed, MotorStorm, Formula 1, NASCAR, World Rally Championship, Race Driver, Dirt, Test Drive, the list goes on, and I apologise if I haven't included your favourites. Released on the PlayStation 1, Gran Turismo placed an emphasis on realism, even going as far as to make players first pass a series of virtual driving tests in order to progress to the racing track. The original GT featured 140 cars, each with its own true-to-life spec and 11 circuits. It began the first steps towards bridging the gap between the real world and that of video games. It has since become a popular series for Sony, so much so that numerous games have been released in the series, and announced to be released later this year, GT Sport will mark 20 years of Gran Turismo games gracing the PlayStation console. There is even a GT Academy, which provides a pathway for gaming enthusiasts who top the leaderboards to see if they can take their gaming skills out onto the real racing track. With the rise of Microsoft through the Xbox consoles, they too have entered the fray of realistic driving through the Forza Motorsport series, and for over a decade now have produced quality driving games that with each release get closer and closer to the cars we drive in real life. Since the early 2000s, driving games have been moving closer and closer to the driving experiences of the real world and the machines that they are based upon. Advancements in technology through hardware and software have helped not only how driving games look and feel, but also in the way they are controlled. Racing steering wheel controllers, hydraulic simulators, if you're lucky to afford them, as well as the more recent introduction of virtual reality, gamers of today now have the best opportunity to get as close to the action without physically sitting in a real car. The experience is blurred between the racetrack and the gaming lounge that gaming developers are in constant consultation with professional race drivers and motorsport engineers in order to bring real-world telemetry, physics and handling to the games they produce. The ever-evolving internet has also seen the rise of esports of the past few years, and online driving championships can now be found through the latest title Project Cars and also iRacing. People take these races and games so seriously that virtual race teams are now in existence with real race engineers and drivers setting up in-game cars as they would in the real world. These games even broadcast races through social media and are presented in similar style to the motorsport races we find on TV. The driving game genre is an amazing genre in the video game library, and one that has evolved and lasted since the dawn of video games. Whilst we have only scratched the surface in terms of games and content, one thing remains, and that is, as long as people are gaming, people will be driving. Thank you for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed the content of this episode. Be sure to follow Aussie Gamers Express at aussiegamersexpress.com and follow us on Facebook, Twitch, YouTube and Twitter by searching Aussie Gamers Express. I have been RoyBoy, and this is RoyBoy's Retro Rewind. Until next time, happy gaming.